Welcome to Rappahannock Issues. I'm Tom Cohen,
And I'm David Kerr.
and we're going to be looking at topics that are of interest to our community, both regionally and to the state. Welcome back to Rappahannock Issues. I'm Tom Cohen with Stephen Farnsworth and David Kerr, talking about the American presidency and sort of ranking and saying whatnot. We're going to say we've talked about overrated presidents, so we'll do underrated presidents. The presidents that we think that the history books and government books and the media just really don't give enough kudos to. So, Stephen, you can have the first shot at.
Well, I really put the first President Bush into this category of underrated president. I think sometimes we think that presidents are not successful if they're not reelected. But the truth of the matter is that when you look at what George H.W. Bush accomplished in 4 years, you're looking at a pretty successful presidency from a number of angles. The first thing was the flexibility, something that I think is really important in a president. He said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Now, he never should have said that. But he realized it was a mistake, and he went down the road of fixing it. And as a result, the economy was in much better shape in the 1990s than it was in the 1980s. Part of that is to Clinton's credit, part of it is to Bush's credit. But I think the most important thing to think about when you think about Bush 41 is the extent to which he handled masterfully the breakup of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. When you look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, it could very easily have led into a lot of problems for the U.S. The last dying breath of the Soviet Union could have been World War III. I think that the Bush team very effectively did not overplay, did not gloat, did not push for rapid movement, but rather allowed things to come apart of their own accord. And I think that's something to be really recognized. I mean, it's hard to grade a president for what didn't happen, but this is one of the cases where I really think we should. George W. Bush had very effective foreign policy skills, and his presidency was one that required those skills, and he handled it quite well.
Would you, just a quick question on that, would you put the Gulf War as another example of
Yes,
foreign policy?
absolutely. I want to give everyone time to talk, but,
Oh, no,
but I think that the wisdom of stopping after the liberation of Kuwait was demonstrated most effectively by the mess that followed with Bush II in Iraq. The limited goals of the first Gulf War were ones that allowed for the coalition to remain in place and did not create the power vacuum that the removal of Saddam Hussein did with respect to the second Gulf War. And so one of the things that George W. Bush did was demonstrate the utility of his father's approach to politics.
I'm going to agree with Bush 41. I also think the coalition building was brilliant. I'm going to say McKinley, who, as I said, mentioned before, he did a lot to rebuild the country and connect it after the Civil War and push for civil rights. You have Coolidge, who, again, they just make a stereotypical thing, but there's a professor at UVA who's been doing some research, and Coolidge, he's researching the KKK, and Coolidge had the FBI infiltrate the Klan and to report back what they were doing and to try to destroy the Klan from the inside. So I think there's a lot more there to Coolidge than people give that credit to. And I'll say Reagan. I'll disagree with my honorable gentleman. I think that the fall of the Soviet Union was masterful in the way he did it. Yes, he was did a better job. He could have done a better job managing a different management style. But I think that the economic boom that he created, the economics, the government policies, I think really led to a different way for this country. And I think most historians and academics don't give him as much credit, particularly with what happened with the Cold War. David?
Well, I have one that most people might not even know he was president, and that was Chester A. Arthur. He was a vice president who became president on the death of Garfield, James Garfield. And he was a product of a fairly corrupt machine politics in New York, a beneficiary of the very system he actually ended up reforming. It was the Pendleton Act, which he advocated and pushed very heavily, and then signed, which created the basics of the modern civil service. I'm a retired civil servant myself, and it took the system away from an entire spoils system where everybody was a political appointee to a competitive-based civil service. It really changed the country into something more modern and more functional. And this was a fellow who had entirely grown up in a different world. He saw the presidency as more than his history. He saw himself as doing something more important. And he wasn't even that interested in renomination, but he did what it was, that moment of leadership, if you will.
Well, and I love Chester too, and it's sort of interesting. He was told by the party, if you push this through, we will not nominate you again, and he felt it was the right thing to do. I always find it interesting to see people who you were talking about, how you handle a crisis. If the way you've always perceived something isn't working, do you try to change it and do something different? For people who are in their 40s or 50s, it's sort of an anathema to us. It's sort of like, no, this is the way it works. And his, truly, I mean, he was raised in the spoils system, saw it didn't work, and said, we need something different. He doesn't get as much, and I'm not saying he deserves, he's underrated, but Hoover, to a certain extent, I mean, at the beginning he was trying one method for the Depression, and when they didn't work, started going towards other things to try to make it work. And I think to a lot of presidents, that's an element of growth that you were talking about, Truman.
Well, and I would give in my second on favorites, underrated, and maybe history will never agree with this, but the Camp David Accords, which were the first, at that time, all things are relative to the time and place, human rights in Latin America, Jimmy Carter. Now, he did not fare well towards the end of his term. There was a real crisis of leadership, but there were some steady accomplishments during the period. The first rearmament of America post end of Vietnam began under him. All the major weapon systems that Ronald Reagan took credit for were actually started under Carter. I think he's been an outstanding ex-president. I don't think his tenure was quite as bad as people like to think it is.
Well, if we're talking about a second sort of underrated president, I would nominate Eisenhower for that on my list.
Yes.
And again, for that same decision in moment of crisis, in the Little Rock crisis, when the Supreme Court said in 1954 that desegregation should occur with all deliberate speed, the South heard the word deliberate and the North heard the word speed. When you think about Eisenhower, though, in Little Rock, you had to make a decision right now, and he demonstrated at great political risk that resistance to the federal government was futile, that there was going to be desegregation, and it's going to occur now, and that's the end of it. And by sending the military into Little Rock, preventing much worse violence, I think the writing was then on the wall for the Jim Crow South, and that cost political consequences to the Republicans, to be sure, but that was a moment where a president faced with a crisis like Truman, like Bush 41, handled it very well.
And it goes to that thing of following the Constitution. The Supreme Court says X, he follows it, whereas at Jackson, the Supreme Court says X, he ignores it. We can't ignore the fact that we're almost done. I think we have about 30 seconds. Are we pretty much in agreement that worst presidents would be Buchanan and Harding and such?
As I think I've told you, Warren Harding is my great-great-uncle, but we try not to talk about it.
No. At least he
For good reason.
And he knew he shouldn't be president. So that's, I think Buchanan, the more information we find, is just horrible. We just thought he was feckless before, but then it turns out there's been research that he helped write the Dred Scott decision. To have a president of the United States writing a Supreme Court decision is totally, mind-blowing, but let alone one of the worst decisions that the court ever made. And one of the worst decisions would not be to turn back into Rappahannock issues. I thank Stephen Farnsworth for coming and partaking in one of our favorite hobbies in rating the presidents, and we hope that you come back to Rappahannock issues real soon.